The Lord be with you. Well, welcome back to this conversation that we are having about all things working together for good. That sort of nebulous, mysterious statement made in the letter to the Romans. And we have been using the life and the narrative of Jonah as a kind of test case. What does it look like if not everything in our lives looks like it's good? And if maybe we find ourselves in contention with God in certain areas of life, how does God still work things out in a way that is beneficial for us and maybe in a way that is beneficial for the world? And Jonah has some interesting insights. Now, as of our last video, we've gotten to a point in this reading and this study where I'm going to suggest that maybe we have misunderstood Jonah in years past. And what is Jonah actually about? Maybe our Sunday school classes and our children's story Bibles and even some of our sermons have led us to believe that Jonah is just about this miracle of a man getting swallowed by a giant whale. Or maybe it's about God's mercy and how it extends even to the most unlikely of people. Or maybe it's about God's people and their prejudice towards outsiders. Or maybe it's just a foreshadowing of Christ's spending 3 days in the heart of the earth, just like Jonah spent 3 days in the heart of the fish. And that's the only purpose of the story. What I would like to suggest, and maybe a way I would like us to look at Jonah a bit differently, is what if the heart of the story of Jonah is actually about prayer? What if it's about time alone with God? What if it's about all of the other things in our life falling away so that when there's no one but God in us, prayer, the fish and this story of being inside the fish, it actually creates this incubator, this womb for true prayer to happen. And with true prayer is true intimacy and true transformation, both for us as individuals as well as for the world around us and our participation in God's mission for the world around us. So in order to pick that theme up and maybe flesh that out a little bit more, just a reminder that so much of this has been about the voice of God trying to get Jonah's attention. God's voice has been very active throughout the narrative thus far. God has commanded Jonah. He's spoken to Jonah and said, I want you to go to Nineveh and to preach against it. God commanded the storm so that the storm would come upon the sea to stop the boat that Jonah was in so that he couldn't flee from God. And we're told that God commanded the fish so that it might show up and swallow Jonah when he was thrown into the sea. And that is where we are going to pick up the narrative today. Reminder, because I am reading from the Jewish Study Bible, that the Hebrew scriptures in chapter 2 do not match the chapter and verse numbers from our English Bible. So in the Hebrew Bible, I'm actually reading from chapter 2, verse 1 through verse 10. But in your English Bibles, this would technically be chapter 1, verse 17 through chapter 2, verse 9. But let's hear what the word of the Lord has to say. Yahweh prepared a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. From the belly of the fish, Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God. He said, out of my distress I called to Yahweh, and he answered me. From the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you threw me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood enveloped me. All your surging waves passed over me. I thought, I have been banished from your sight, but I will again look at your holy temple. The water surrounded me, threatened my life. The deep closed over me, seaweed twined around my head. I was going down to the bottoms of the mountains, to a land whose bars would close me in forever. But you brought me up alive from the pit. Yahweh, my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came into you, into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols give up their source of mercy. But I, speaking my thanks aloud, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation comes from Yahweh. These are the true words of our eternal God. Now, what's interesting is Jonah is in sort of a strange place at this point. And believe it or not, he is finally doing what was echoed for him to do back in chapter 1, which is pray. He was challenged when the storm was surging and he was down below in the innards of the ship. He was sleeping. He was inactive. He was like a dead man. And the captain of the ship had to come down and to jar him awake and say, get up and start praying. We need all hands on deck. We need everybody praying to their gods because we don't know exactly what's happening and we want to make sure any and every God can hear us so we might be saved. Now, we're never told that Jonah actually prays. But now Jonah goes down into the dark innards of another place, not a ship this time, but the belly of a huge fish. And it's while he's in there that Jonah is finally stirred to action. He finally responds. He finally prays. He finally acknowledges the God who's been trying to get his attention this entire time. And what's interesting is he draws very similar conclusions to what the psalmist draws in Psalm 139. Now, many people know Psalm 139 because the beginning of it has some familiar language that we like. It's very comforting to us, like we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Our bodies, God knows all about them, and they are amazing things. But there's a point later in the psalm where the psalmist says, where can I go to get away from the presence of God? If I go to the highest mountains up into the heavens, he is there. If I go down into the heart of the earth, into the bowels of Sheol, of death, he is there. There's nowhere I can go to get away from God's presence. As a matter of fact, even if I were in the darkest of nights, the darkness would be light to God. He would be able to see me even in the deepest, darkest depths. And Jonah seems to acknowledge that same thing. It doesn't matter that I'm in the middle of the sea. It doesn't matter that I'm inside of a fish. It doesn't matter that I'm going down to my death. I trust that when I pray, God can see me. There's nowhere I can go where I am away from the presence of God, even in my deepest, darkest situations. God is there with me, and God can hear me when I pray. And what's interesting is even though we call this a prayer of Jonah, it is very much written and framed as a psalm. And some psalms are prayers. It's a kind of poetry. And as a matter of fact, this particular prayer of Jonah, this psalm of Jonah, follows a pattern that we see in other psalms. There's actually a subgenre of psalms called Psalms of Thanksgiving, particularly individual thanksgiving. There are some psalms of communal thanksgiving. And Jonah's prayer, Jonah's psalm, follows exactly that same pattern. So just so you can hear another one of these psalms and recognize this pattern a little bit more, I'm going to read for you Psalm 116. It says, I love that Yahweh heard my voice when I prayed, because he turned his ear to me. I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death were all around me. Sheol's constrictions held me fast. I was finding only distress and anguish, but I called on the name of Yahweh. Please, O Yahweh, save me. Yahweh is merciful and righteous. Yes, our God is compassionate. Yahweh preserves the thoughtless. When I was brought low, he saved me. My soul, return to your rest, for Yahweh has been generous toward you. Yes, you have rescued me from death, my eyes from tears and my feet from falling. I will go on walking in the presence of Yahweh in the lands of the living. I will keep on trusting, even when I say I am utterly miserable, even when in my panic I declare everything human is deceptive. How can I repay Yahweh for all his generous dealings with me? I will raise the cup of salvation and call on the name of Yahweh. I will pay my vows to Yahweh in the presence of all his people. Skip the page. From Yahweh's point of view, the death of those faithful to him is costly. O Yahweh, I am your slave. I am your slave, the son of your slave girl. You have removed my fetters. I will offer a sacrifice of thanks to you and will call on the name of Yahweh. I will pay my vows to Yahweh in the presence of all his people, in the courtyards of Yahweh's house. There in your very heart, Jerusalem. Hallelujah. Now, maybe you caught it, maybe you didn't, but these individual psalms of thanksgiving tend to have very similar elements in them. There is some kind of crisis that the psalmist goes through. The psalmist eventually cries out to God. God hears and God saves. He rescues the psalmist in some way. And then the psalmist promises to offer some kind of vows of thanksgiving, probably sacrifices as well as verbal testimonies that the psalmist will give in the presence of God's people. That is, in his temple, in his courts, at the place of sacrifice. All of those same elements are here in Jonah's prayer, in Jonah's psalm. He cries out to God because he's going through a time of crisis. There's all this imagery of death and Sheol and the grave. And when he cries out to God, God hears, God rescues, and Jonah makes promises to pay his vows in the presence of God's holy people. There is a temple theology in this, and these kinds of prayers, these kinds of psalms flow out from Solomon's dedication of the temple and the prayer that he gave when he dedicated the temple. And he said things like, whenever your people pray to you, O God, even if they've been disobedient, even if they are in foreign lands, when they churn towards your holy temple, which Solomon had just built and had dedicated, may you hear from heaven and may you rescue them. This is the confidence that Jonah has. I'm now churning my heart toward God's earthly dwelling place, the temple, and therefore I trust that he's going to hear me. I trust that he's going to save me. And because he's going to save me, I will go back there one day and I will pay my vows. I will offer a sacrifice in the presence of God's people, and I will give testimony of all of the wonderful things that he has done. Now, there's actually one aspect that is kind of missing from this pattern of a psalm of thanksgiving. We'll talk about that a little bit later. What I want you to note, though, is that Jonah is coming to the party a little bit late. Because remember, back in chapter 1, the sailors on the ship, when they saw the deliverance that happened after they cast Jonah into the deep, they immediately, either there or they were going to do it as soon as they got back to their homeland, they made sacrifices and fulfilled their vows to Yahweh, the God of Israel, even though that wasn't their God. And now Jonah is learning the lesson Even though he's an insider, he's part of God's people, he's learning the lesson about doing this after the outsiders, the Gentiles, have already learned the same lesson and done the same thing. This is going to be a repeating pattern for Jonah. And one of the things that Jonah learns in his prayer is that those who worship vain idols give up their source of mercy. There is a difference between God's love and false loves. There is a difference between God and all false gods. Every other god, it doesn't matter who worships that god, whether it's a Gentile or whether it's a Jew, that God cannot save. That God is not merciful. That God is not truly loving. But Jonah says only our God is loving. He is merciful. We've seen him in the story be merciful to the Gentiles. And Jonah trusts that he's going to be merciful to him as well. True salvation actually comes in renewed relationship with the Lord. Jonah experiences that, but he only experiences that when he is in the womb of prayer. He's in the belly of the great fish. He has time alone with God. All other distractions, all other rhythms of life have fallen away. And now it's just Jonah and God, and that leads to a renewed intimacy, a renewed relationship, and therefore a new kind of salvation. What does that look like in your life? How is your time alone with God? How is the womb of prayer being engaged by you? And what sort of benefits are you seeing for you and for the world around you? Or what sort of neglect is there even as you're watching this? Problem, Jonah is still in the belly of the fish. And how do we know what's going to happen just because he's had a prayer of renewed relationship? What is his relationship with the Lord actually going to look like moving forward? And how is he going to get out of the situation that he's in? And to find out more about those details, we're just going to have to wait till the next reading and the next video. So until then, in these ongoing days of crises and near-death experiences and crying out to the Lord, may the peace of God be with you. Amen.